The code that we'll be working with today is out in the VB Intermediate repository, and this one is going to be in the 11.26.12 folder, and it is in a project called crud, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But let's see where we are at. Where we left off in the last lecture was we had set our application up to be able to use the username and the password entered in on the form to build a connection string that we use to connect to the MySQL database. We have a simple query running that will return everything from the hello world table. When we take our results into the data set, we're looping through each data row in the data set, and we are adding to our list box the value that's in the message field. Additionally, to our query, we are also doing an insert into the database. So this text box will be the name value, and this text box will be the message value. A lot of the code is the same as it is for a query. We still are building our connection string. We still need our connection object. And what's different is, whereas we were doing a query before, select star, now we're actually doing an insert command. So we called the variable command. We're formatting that string. You see I have a 0 and a 1 placeholder. We're formatting that string with the message and the name values from our form. We're using that connection string to build our DB connection object. We open it. We build a MySQL command object, whereas for the query we are building a MySQL database adapter. But here we're doing a command, and we say execute non-query. We're not expecting anything back from this command. So that's why we do this. And then lastly, we have this all in a try-catch block, but in our finally block, we're making sure that that connection is close. We don't want to leave any dangling connections to the database, because that might cause trouble when we want to connect again. So where does this leave us? Well, this is a great application, but all it does is read and write, and we don't have any real way of getting at that database if we wanted to update one of the records or if we wanted to remove one of them. And that's where the whole crud acronym comes into play. And what crud stands for: create, update, delete. So we have CR lowercase because that's taken from the same word, update, delete. So we say crud. And any application that's going to be connecting with a database almost always has this standard set of them. You might lock them down on permissions of the logged in user, but that's your data layer. That is going to be how you work with the data that's out there. And how do you do that? Well, you have the ability to create a new record. You want to be able to update or edit existing records, and you might want to delete the records that are out there. So we say crud. There's not a Q or an S in there for query or select, because that's sort of assumed. You wouldn't have an application that didn't let you read what was in the database, but then maybe only let you create an update and delete it. So that's assumed. That's why we don't have a fourth item in there as part of the acronym. So what we have now is, well, we have insert, which is our create, but then we're also going to want to be able to do an update or an edit and a delete. And in order to be able to do that, it works just like how it would if you were just writing standard queries. You need to have a way of isolating the actual record that you're at. Yes, we could write a button here that said delete all or update all, but that's not how things work. You would go after a single record. So I have Workbench open here, and when we do stuff in a database and you have to write a query, often I will go into the query editor inside of Workbench, and I'll sort of proof out what it is that I actually need to do. Depending on what it is, sometimes we can even use the interface to generate the query. But what I was talking about in terms of isolating these values out is the way our table is designed. We have in our database table three columns. We have ID, message, and name. And if you recall from your database classes, ID is something that we call a primary key. And what makes a primary key special is that it's guaranteed to be unique across all of the records. So if I were to go for the row that had an ID of 15, I know that I'd be getting this row here. If I was going after the row that had an ID of 18, I'd know that I'd get this message here. And so when we do a select and we want all of the values, that's fine. We don't need to specify that ID. But if you wanted to update or delete a specific row in your database, you have to access it by the ID. Now if we look in our code, when I'm pulling my values down and populating my list box, you'll see all I'm getting here is I'm going after that message column in there. Even though I'm only using the message column, the ID column and the name column are still part of that data row. But we're not doing anything with that. And it's sort of just kind of sitting there and being forgotten about. So what we want to do is we want to have a way of being able to get all of these values where we want them so that we can access them if we need to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create three collections, and we're going to create one collection for each field in the database that we're tracking. Now, if this was a real application, and this will be something that we do next week, is we would want to build a class that represented the data that we're pulling out. So I would have a message class, and that message class would have three attributes. It would have an ID, a message, and a name attribute. And what we would want to do ideally is to create a collection that contained instances of that class. So we wouldn't have to go and create three collections. But my idea is to keep this as simple as possible. So we will create a collection for each value that we want to track. And then lastly, call ID as collection. And so here inside of my for loop, where I was adding that value in there, we would do this. And we would add each value to its respective collection. And so what we get now is, if I'm running my application, do my query, the order at which these are added to the list box is the same order that they are added to with the collection. So if I were to use the selected index property of here on the selected index changed event, this would give me 0. And so what I should be able to do is, since this is the first element in that collection, I should be able to go to the message collection, the name collection, and the ID collection and get the first element of each, and that should match up correspondingly to what I have out of my database. And so to illustrate what this is going to do, when someone selects one of these rows in the list box, I want to populate these text boxes with the values that have been pulled out. So double click on the list box, and I'm going to declare a temporary variable, and this is going to contain the list box selected index. And so now what we can do is I will say txtname.text equals call name temp index. Now, there's a potential pitfall here in that on our form, selected index for a list box is 0 based. It starts at 0 and goes up to length -1. However, if you recall, collections in VB start at 1 and go to the way to length. So I'm going to have to temporarily add 1 to this as an offset so that I'm getting the right value. If you forget to do this and you select the first index, you may have your application crash. Next, I'll do message.text equals call message temp index plus 1. And so now it's populating with the correct values that I'm pulling out of the database and I was storing into my collection. But the real thing of this is now what we have is, with the selection, we have the ID. And so if we'd like to reflect this on our form, I'm going to add a label in here. And we'll add that in as well. Typically, you wouldn't ever display an ID to a user. That's something that's sort of behind the scene, and I have it as a label because that's not something that we'd ever want to change. That's something that is assigned to us by the database every time we do an insert. It's an auto increment field, which means that it'll increment the existing ID by 1, and that ensures its uniqueness across the whole table. But what we're going to do with this now is, since we do have the ID, now we can isolate that unique row in the database so that we can do an update on it, or that we could do a delete as well if we want to. So we have to add a couple more buttons to our form. I'm going to copy this button here. I'm going to have to resize my form a little bit and the group box. I'm going to copy that, and this one's going to be my update button. And then also a delete button. Let's go after the delete first, since it is a little more straightforward. I'm going to double click on there. And we've already done a lot of the legwork that we need to do to be able to use this. In fact, if I copy all of the code from my button insert event and I paste it into my delete, the only thing we have to change is the actual SQL command text. That's because also this is not a query. We aren't expecting any data back from this. What we want is the database to do something with the data that we already have. What we do need is we have to be able to get the ID from what has been selected. So I'm going to declare ID as a string, even though the way the database sees the integer of an ID, when we write it into a query, it really expects a string out of it. And in fact, that's how we stored it, and that's how we pulled it out of the database. So since we are building the command dynamically, it's okay that we're tracking it as a string rather than an integer. So if you recall, ID was call ID at the index of lbdata.selectedIndex plus 1. Previously, we had pulled it out into a temp index, but that's because we had used it several times. Here, I'm only going to use it once. So I have the ID now of the selected index, and what I have to do now is change this that was an insert into an actual delete command. And although I could try direct coding it into Visual Studio, remember I have a workbench that's going to help me out with this as well. And sometimes it can generate it for you. Other times you might want to be able to proof it out here. But what I can do is, in MySQL workbench, I can right click on the table and I can say edit table data. And this would be how we would go in and edit. But we can also select a row and we can right click and delete it. Once I commit my changes, it gives me this query. If I hit cancel, it won't actually run the command, but I can copy this, hit cancel. I'll go back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to completely get rid of this stuff in here and paste in my query that I had. And now if we had left it just like this, it would consistently try and delete the row with a value of ID of 19. So what we want to do instead is swap this out with a 0. Now you'll see it's got these tick marks that it might give you. That's because it tries to fully qualify the table that you're at. We don't really need that for our application. So I'm going to get rid of this VB demo and the tick marks and just have it be at hello world. In fact, it might even choke on these because those aren't generally universal characters for building commands inside of .NET. And I cleaned it up a little bit. So I have delete from hello world where ID equals and then a placeholder of 0. And the next line, where we had formatted that properly to pull in the message and the name, instead, since this is the format string now, I'm going to delete those, and instead I'm just going to put ID. It's a single value because what we have here is a single placeholder. So once this is done, we should have a command that's going to properly generate the SQL based on the row that we've selected. And what we can do, even if we're a little nervous about destroying our database or something like that, is we can comment this line out, because this is the block of code that's actually going to do something, and we're going to put a breakpoint right here, and we can take a look and see what it would build for us. When you're working with delete commands, there is always the potential from accidentally deleting everything from your database. If we left off the where clause on this and we just said delete from hello world, it would in fact delete every value from that table. So that's why we want to probably be careful on delete more than any of the other ones. And it looks like it generated it correctly. So now I'm going to uncomment this and we'll try running it and see what happens. I had a breakpoint set. I'll remove that and run it. Now it looked alright. We'll hit query again, and you saw, in fact, that it has been removed. And I'll delete this one as well. I'll run the query again. It looks like that one did not go through. We'll have to see what was going on with that. I think one thing that we might be experiencing is that we left these single quotes around our ID here, which generally is reserved for strings, and we want to leave that as an integer. Alright, so let's try that again with those single apostrophes removed. And it looks like that did do the trick. And I think what we're going to want to do is run the same code that's running on this query every time after we do an insert and a delete, so that we don't have to keep clicking this query to see if our data updated properly or not. So I have some code in button query click, and I want to actually reuse this. So every time we say reuse, that means we want to put this into a sub. A sub versus a function because it's not returning any values. And we'll say, call this refresh data. paste that in there, and now I will call this sub inside of my button query click after my button insert click is completed. Now notice, I'm going to put this inside my try catch block, not in my finally, but I'm going to put it inside my try catch block after execute query. We're not interested in updating that data if it failed. So we wouldn't put it in the EX, and we wouldn't put it in the finally because we would not want it to execute regardless every time. And then in button delete, the same thing, I'll put it after execute non-query. So now what I can do is I can try putting some new values in. And it updated it right away. And take that new value. Uh-oh. We got a crash. Collection index must be in the range of 1 to the size of the collection. So we got an error of not updating our collections after we did the insert and delete. So what we should do is go into our refresh, and you see what happened is I cleared out the list box. But if you look, what I'm doing here is I'm still adding it and adding it, adding it. We're not taking into account that we're actually clearing those out every time, is what we should be doing, because it's fresh data. So I'm going to say call message.clear, call name.clear, and call id.clear. And this way we can ensure that we're getting fresh and accurate data each time. In addition to that, what might be a good idea is what we're doing here is we're just sort of blindly accessing what's at that index, and we should really be testing this before we do anything else like that. So we should say if temp index plus 1 is greater than call name dot length dot count, apologize, then something is wrong. Generally, if you can prevent exceptions and show messages instead, that's always best. If it's not, we'll put that in our else block. Everything is okay. And this should at least take care of it. It might not make it work perfect, but at least we'll be avoiding those application crashes. So let's take a look here again. And it looks like everything is okay now. I believe the problem was that we weren't clearing out those old collection values. So now we have delete and we have insert. We have to go for the update now. So what update is going to do is it's going to take the record that's selected and it's going to update these values as they are in the database. Again, let's use workbench to sort of proof out what we want to do. So I'm going to go to File, New Query tab. You may want to go to the database you're working in and double click. That will select it as the default database that you're working with. This way you don't have to prefix your table names with the database name. So let's work on our update query. We're going to say update hello world and we want to say what it is that we're going to change. So we're going to say set message equals, let's put in some blank values here. Set message equal to this, what I have is test, 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 comma, name equals my name here. That's what we want to update, but we also have to tell it where to update. If we ran it just like this, it would go through and it would update every record to be these values, and we don't want that. It's not quite as bad as a delete, but if you think about it, you're still losing data. So we would say where ID equals, and then I believe we still have an ID of 15 out there. I'm going to switch over into one of these other queries. And we still have one of 15. So if I run this, we should be good to go. No error messages. If I go back into my previous query and do a select all, you see that it did in fact work. So we're good on this query. We can take this and we can copy this into our program now. So now I have that query on my clipboard. So I'm going to go into my form here. I'm going to double click update. I'm going to paste this in here for now. I'm going to put a comment in front of it because we're not quite ready to use this. What we should do is, since again we're doing another command, is I can copy, and this time I'm going to copy from button delete instead of button insert, because if you remember, on delete we're getting that ID. So this is a little closer right off the bat than what we need. So I'm copying all the code from my button delete click. I'm going to paste that into my button update. Oops, I did not grab that. So all we have to change now is, whereas we were using this delete, we want to use our update query now. So copy that, don't copy the comment over, and we'll paste that in. And again, where we are hard coding these values in, well, we have to populate this with some other things. First of all, we have to get rid of the ID, which we already have, and then we have the message and the name that we want to, which we're going to pull from our form. So it's a practice of going in and trying to identify the things that are going to be dynamic per each command. So I'm replacing the default message with a 0 placeholder, setting the name to be the 1 placeholder, and then the ID is going to be placeholder 2. And I don't know if it generated a semicolon for us, but I'm going to throw that on there anyways. The next line, whereas we were just pulling the ID in before, now we have to give it 3 values because we have 3 placeholders. So I'm going to say txt message dot text, txt name dot text, and then ID, which we've already pulled out as well. Everything else will stay the same. In fact, we can leave our refresh data on there. We can leave everything alone. And usually what you'll do is, we have 3 different subs for each of the actions, right? We have an insert, we have an update and delete. And often what you'll do is you'll take all this code and you'll sort of make it into a generic function or sub, where instead of putting this on a button event, we would have a sub where we would just pass in this string. We build this string somewhere else, and then we pass it into a sub that has all this code. But let's work with what we have now. Specifically, we're working on our update command. I'll run my query. This is the one I'll go after. Hi there, and we'll put a little more in. Click the update command, and it went in and updated it as well. How about this one? Do an update, and that is updating the value in there. Everything else still works. Insert, remember, takes these values right off the bat. Let's put an insert in there. We have 2 of these, and then also our delete works as well. So what we have now is a full database client to be able to access all of these fields in the database, all the fields that we want to be able to edit. Remember, we can't edit the ID without causing some serious problems, and often databases will throw an error if you attempt to do that because it is a primary key. But the other fields we have, name and message, we're able to change those, we're able to create new ones, and we're able to delete them. So what we have here is a full client that can handle all CRUD operations, as we would say. But how can we do this better? I think if you haven't been overwhelmed by now with all of this code, you will be if you ever try and have it do more than this. And it's not that it's outside of comprehension, it's just it's a lot of code. It's especially a lot of code that we can't really touch. If you remember, we have referred to it before almost as boilerplate code. This won't be changing from implementation to implementation. We're always going to want to close it. Often we'll be doing this execute non-query. So how can we optimize this for reuse? And furthermore, not only reuse, but if we go after the concept of encapsulation, we do encapsulation to hide code. Sometimes it's for organization, but sometimes it's for our own peace of mind, to not be constantly reminded that maybe there's some code there that we're a little scared of, or we're a little not quite sure what it does, but we know that if we use it right, it works. So let's see how this would work. I'm going to create another sub, and we're going to call it execute SQL command. It's going to take a command as a string, and since it's a sub, it's not going to return any values. And since we've become very good at doing this, I'm going to copy everything out of button delete, click, and I'm going to paste this into my SQL command code. You'll notice we get an IntelliSense error on command right away because that's what we named our parameter, and that's okay because that was by design. Now I want to delete this, and I also want to delete the lines of code where I'm actually building that command, because what's going to happen is by the time someone calls this, they'll have already created the command for us. We really shouldn't be formatting a command inside here. In addition to that, we shouldn't be accessing our form. That's going to happen before we ever get here. What we're building here is truly, we could refer to it as a data layer function. It doesn't have any knowledge of the rest of our application. All it knows is that when it gets this command, it's supposed to execute it. If there's an error, show the error. If not, at the end, close it down, and everything works as expected. So now we can take the code that exists on our delete button and our update button and swap it out with this sub. So what would that leave these to do? Well, what this does now is it is going to be building this query and nothing else. So specifically on my button delete click, I'm going to get rid of all of those database objects. Going to get some errors for a while. That's okay. We're going to stay the course. We're going to get rid of this try and catch block. We no longer need this. All of this code is being handled inside of our new sub. What we care about is our command. Now we've gotten rid of all of our errors. We're formatting our string nicely, and so all that's left to do is to call our sub. We say execute SQL command, and we pass it our string. Now, this is so much nicer than it was before. It was getting kind of scary. And now we are able to concentrate on what it is that we want the database to do without getting hung up in all of the implementation details. This is encapsulation. We're not really putting inside of a class, but the concept still remains, is that we're hiding that code somewhere else so we can concentrate on what makes this particular command important. Following through with that, let's do the same approach for our button update. Get rid of these lines here. I can get rid of everything in this try and catch block, because again, that is the stuff that is connecting to our database. And now that I have the command built, I can call execute SQL command and just pass it the command. So now we have much cleaner code. We could even combine these lines here. I'm declaring it to be a string.empty. I was doing that outside of the try catch. I can do this inline here to save some lines. So now we have 4, whereas before we probably had something closer to 20. Furthermore, what this also frees us up to do is maybe we can have a little more complex logic. We had gone over SQL injection attacks. This client would in fact be open to a SQL injection attack because we're not checking this value here. What we could do instead is we could split out those inputs as separate variables, and as our simplest approach, we said if we strip out semicolons, that should take care of the majority of these. It's not 100% foolproof, but if we do that, we'll be in better shape. So passing message there, instead of pulling it directly from the input, and do the same thing for name. And so now we have something where we're actually stripping out the injection attack possibility. And it looks better. You think it gives us a little more ambition to put in some more complex logic versus trying to mess with that all in here, which is quite a bit of code that we didn't write, so it's using third-party libraries. And we'll put it in here, and this is only dedicated to building the logic out that's going to create this SQL command. So there we have it. What we will be doing in the next lecture is to say, let's kind of get rid of those 3 collections that we're using, because it's really not scalable. If we were to add an additional field to our database table, we'd have to create another collection to track that. And the best approach is to create a class and then use that class to store instances of it inside the collection so that we can grab one element out of that collection and work with the attributes. So instead of saying call messages index 0, we can go, .id, .message, .name, and go after it that route. I'll put this updated code out on GitHub. And again, check Blackboard for the actual connection strings to be able to use the username and the password.